Ladies and gentlemen, Suzi Siegel.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me. First, let me just take in a whole room of New York City nerds like that. I'm such a proud New York City nerd. I love the city so much, and so to be able to have written a book about New York City and get it published, as Matt said, I grew up in the Bronx. In a tiny apartment, which you'll hear about, and now I live in a tiny apartment, a co-op in Jackson Heights. I mean, I don't know who doesn't live in a tiny apartment in New York City. That's not really bragging rights. So I wrote this book, which you will see I am dressed like today. That's part of my shtick. It's called Tiny New York, and it's tiny. I call it like a miniature coffee table book because there's a lot of photographs in here. And this book is about the smallest things in the biggest city. So that's the little cute, snazzy sort of hook and sales line. And somehow I managed to sell in a book about New York City. The most exciting thing that happened right at the end of 2018 is, I don't know how to say it, is it Fodors or Fedors? Fodors. Yeah, the travel guide. They included this book as one of the best travel books of the year to give as a gift. So, which was amazing. And they said this book might actually have an angle that no one's ever done before about New York City. And so that is, I don't even know how I managed to do it, but I'll talk a little bit about that. So, what does that mean, the smallest things in the biggest city? That's the cute hook. But you'll find out it's not really all that cute. Because you guys are experts in New York. I'm sure a lot of you are native New Yorkers like me, and you know that this isn't really a cute city. It's a lot of things, but people usually think of tiny as being cute. And I'll talk a little bit later about one of the conclusions I came to about what tiny means. Okay, so the idea and how I came up with the idea, and you guys know more about this than I do, actually, because you are with people all the time who are seeing New York City for the first time. That'll just be running behind me. Those are pictures from the book. And the idea is that people come here and they feel like they need to see the biggest things, right? It's like New York is such a big city. It's called the Big Apple. I have lived here my whole life, and I actually feel overwhelmed by it sometimes. Not by the crowds, but just by the fact that I'll come up on a subway corner and not know which way is northeast, because I've never been there before, or I'll be walking and see a block that I've never seen before, and it's like, you will never actually know this city, know it, and I think for a lot of years, for me, that was really something that was very sort of intimidating about it. So the bigness of New York is kind of what we sell it on too. It's the Big Apple, the buildings are big, the billboards are big, Times Square is huge, right? And it's like, that's what people think of when they think of New York, and that's what people come here looking to see. And my thing was, that it's really easy to look it up, find all that stuff, but while you're doing that, you could easily overlook the little things, right? And that's obviously a metaphor for something bigger, but this book is very literal. Like, I went out and tried to find some of the tiniest things. Matt warned me to tell you guys, because you probably know more about New York City trivia than me, that it is not the tiniest things. The book is not called Tiniest New York. It's called Tiny New York. Because I always get somebody who's like, are you sure that's the tiniest thing? And I'm like, no, I have a disclaimer for that. So the idea is it's really hard, it's really easy here to also feel small. I feel like because the city's so big, there's a lot of money here, a lot of fashion, a lot of lights, right? A lot of people, a lot of ambitious people. Kids come from everywhere. They do technology things that I don't really understand, and they have startups and whatever they do, I don't know. So I started looking into all these nooks and crannies and looking for sort of the smallest versions of what New York has to offer, and I found people. That's what this city is, right? At the end of the day, it's about people. And so each of these stories is told in first person by the person who knows the most about the tiniest thing, or the tiniest place, or who owns the tiniest island, or lives in the tiny apartment. And I feel like through that, I got to know New York City in a way that I had not. And I certainly didn't go out looking for diversity. It's like you don't have to look for it in New York, like you're gonna find it. Especially, by the way, when you're looking for the tiniest things, right? Because those are not gonna be probably the richest people, they're gonna be the hustlers, and they're gonna be people who are immigrants and just aren't working with a lot. Okay, so let's land this plane. What are some of the tiniest subjects in the book? Some of you guys, you can raise your hand, we'll make it interactive. If you know some of these places, maybe I'll quiz you. The tiny basketball in the West Village that's produced some of the sport's biggest legends. Do you guys know that? They call it the Cage. Yeah, it's called the Cage. You guys, that's right, West 4th Street, so fun. So that was one of the tiniest places that I found. New York City's tiniest neighborhood. It's 1/3 of a square mile. Extra credit points. I know more than you do. It's called, oh, you know?
I was going to say probably Vinegar Hill.
Nope, it's called Ramblersville, Queens.
Wow.
And it's this tiny little outback, amazing, can't go into it. It basically survived the hurricane. It's like right underneath the airport. I couldn't believe it when I went there because it was kind of like this forsaken place. And I found this woman who had 90 years old, had lived there her whole life, left thinking she was going to come back the next day, and the storm knocked out her whole house, and she actually came back and rebuilt from the rubble, right? So like, you start to see what these stories, once you start looking at these tiny places. A barbershop with one chair, right? So like, he's got one chair inside and there's 2 chairs waiting outside. That's in Chelsea. It's 90 square feet. And then it's sort of this high to low thing too, right? Because New York's like this sort of gritty, earthy place, but then we also have, you guys know this better than me, some of the most amazing cultural institutions, right? So I went into, this is interesting too, because you cannot Google some of this stuff. I went in and said, okay, let me think of the most quintessential New York things, and then think of the tiniest version. New York Yankees. Easy to find the tiniest New York Yankee, right? And I interviewed him in the dugout of Yankee Stadium, which was amazing, because I'm from the Bronx. In the museum, I found the littlest dinosaur in the Museum of Natural History, and the head of paleontology told me this whole story about how rare it is to find a baby dinosaur. Their bones are brittle. He's taking me to all these places that he's gone to, and he said, people, millions of people, however many millions of people walk through that museum door, they are probably not going to notice this dinosaur, And I'm like, well, now it's in a book. If anybody reads it, this little dinosaur, like, I can't say his name, he's called like Altipinus something saurus. And then I was looking for a police angle. This is the fun stuff too, because it's like, well, what's the tiniest police angle? Once you start thinking about it, by the way, you can't, like, I see New York in a completely different way now, right? Because I'm like, all right, what is quintessential New York? It's the Yankees, it's the museum, it's the police department. Okay, what's smallest precinct house, right? Like, that's boring. I found the tiniest bomb-sniffing police dog. His name is Sully. He's in the transit unit, which was in Queens, and he's a German short-haired pointer. He's like half the size of a regular dog, because most of them are German shepherds. So I found out all about, like, how do you choose a dog to become a dog, a bomb-sniffing police dog? Well, he's got drive. They have a work ethic. Okay, I don't know what that means. My dog sleeps all day, right? Matt Baker knew this one, the tiniest privately owned island in New York City. Yes, that's an easy one. All right, so I found that guy and interviewed him. He's like this Swiss national, and he's got I'm sorry. Oh.
What was the island?
Rat Island. Sorry, it's called Rat Island, and it's off the coast of City Island. Exactly right. Yeah. So this guy went to an auction. This Swiss guy, he ended up building a statue on there of like a Swiss independence fighter from the 1400s. Like, so weird, could only happen in New York, right? And he was like, well, lots of people own boats. Who owns an island? And he was bidding, and his girlfriend was like putting his hand down as it got to like $500,000 or whatever it was. And he bought this thing, and he lives on City Island, and he looks out his window and he sees his own private island. And sometimes he kayaks out there and has a picnic. So I'm like, that's all right, that's cool. So those are some of the ideas. So you can see once you start thinking about that, how interesting it's gonna be. And it was so much fun writing this book. I actually got fired from my job right in the beginning of it, and I was like, oh shit, how am I gonna pay my? And I was like, yes, I get to finish this book without health insurance, but that's fine, right? So Matt asked me, so I assume it'll be interesting to you guys. How did you come up with the idea? My mom is here because she comes to all of mine. She's native from the Bronx, Pelham Parkway. I grew up in Pelham Parkway. Oh, you actually grew up in the South Bronx, of course, wearing concourse. So we just always lived in a tiny apartment. There was never enough room for anything. Sorry, she's rolling her eyes at me. I shared a room with my brother, one bathroom in the house. Like, none of that seemed weird. Didn't have a backyard, had a fire escape. Again, you're a New York City kid, right? So none of this sounds strange until you get out and go to college and realize, like, people have yards and land, and they think they have a place to put their car, they don't have to move their car at 7 in the morning. All these things that just sort of became, it was like, parking spots. Like, how much do people pay for parking? There's no room in this city, and it's like part of the maddening thing about it, and it's why New York City's so expensive and so hard. Sometimes it's really hard to be here. And I remember just like being like, one day I'm gonna I used to see it on TV in the soap operas, like women would have closets and there was like actually space in between the things in the closet. I had like 6 things hanging up on one closet. I was like, one day I'm gonna have that. So really I just always thought about the fact that New York City was such a cramped place and how we somehow make it work, right? And it's like there's an environmental angle to that, right? It's like we're using less resources and everything else. But again, once I started coming up with the concept, I would look up and see, look how somebody squished a building in between 2 buildings that was only an alleyway, and now all of a sudden it's a store. You guys ever notice that? It happens a lot in the West Village, happens a lot on the Upper West Side. It's like, it's so expensive real estate here that people end up using it, and then within their spaces, they end up utilizing every square inch of space. Like, I moved into this co-op in Jackson Heights, and I had those systems put in where you can, and I realized that there was like this much space between the wall and where the shelf was, and I was like, how am I gonna use that space? What's gonna fit there? I'll put some oak tag roll and a yoga mat. You know what I mean? It's like, that's really what it's like, and it's, there's something really beautiful about that, and to me, that got to the heart of what this book was about and what New York was about and what all these people in the book was about. There's sort of this grit, and there's this like, gonna make it happen, doing a lot with a little bit, right? So as I started writing this book, I realized like, okay, there has to be some bigger thing happening here, but I didn't know what it was. I just knew I was going out and finding all these tiny things and interviewing these people, and then it all started coming together. I sat down to put together the introduction, and it's what I opened up with. I started realizing like people think of Tiny as cute, and like the New York version of Tiny is not cute, right? And an example of this is I found the tiniest strip club in New York. I bet if any of you guys know that, you're not gonna raise your hand right now. You're like, I don't know. It's called Pumps, and I held my book party after party there, and my mom came. So it's like, how do you find the tiniest strip club in New York? You cannot Google. It's like amazing that there's things that you can't Google. It's because who's thinking of the world that way, right? It's like, and then I found the tiniest guy living on a houseboat, no shower. This guy lived he was Nepali, which is a landlocked country, and he lives on a houseboat in City Island. He has to go to shore for fresh water, for Wi-Fi, for all that stuff, and he's an immigrant. And then this started coming together also. He was like, you know what? Like, my mom had to carry water on her head in Nepal. Like, for him, it wasn't such a big deal. And that's the hardest thing I could ever imagine, is like freezing on this houseboat and taking a shower outside, cooking on these little tiny things. And I was like, oh, things started clicking, and I was like, there's something about the immigrant spirit, right? And it's like, my grandfather came here, most people, right? It's like our grandparents maybe were from another country. I was like, there's something about this immigrant spirit, and it turned out a lot of the people, like I said in the book, were immigrants. He's like this like resourceful, greedy, don't feel bad for yourself, not a spoiled brat, quite the opposite, right? Like Americans sort of 3 generations later, we become a little bit like sissies. So it was like seeing all these people who were making it happen, but I was like, it's not cute. Tiniest congressional district. Anybody know what that one is?
13.
Yeah, that's right. So it's where this gentleman lives, and it's amazing too because you can barely fit in his congressional district. It's Harlem, East Harlem, Washington Heights, parts of the Bronx, right? And I met with this guy. He's the head, obviously the congressman, and I'm like, well, what's it like? First of all, it all came together. He's the first Dominican American ever to hold a seat in Congress, and he is also the first formerly undocumented immigrant, right? He came here sin papeles, okay, without papers. And this guy's amazing, and he's like, listen, this is a tiny district, but it gets really beat down, and it's hard with so many people crammed into one district. Because as you know, it's by population, right? So the fact that this is the smallest district, he said on a good day, I could walk from my district end to end. He said, I got some colleagues in Alaska who like, I don't know, 400 million square miles, right? With like barely any people. So number one, tiny isn't cute. That became like one of the themes. And then the other thing that I was touching on, it's like tiny doesn't wait for handouts. It's like they don't expect anything. Like immigrants don't come here expecting anybody to give them anything. Nobody wants them. Nobody's helping them, right? They just have to come here, figure out what their social groups are, get a cart, learn how to drive a taxi, even though you're just learning how to speak English, right? So there was this sense of like, these guys aren't waiting for handouts, and women, they're hustling, right? I found a tiny Momo joint with like a Buddhist monk in there who came here to practice his Buddhism. Guess what? Nobody was paying for him. In Buddhist countries, you're in a place of honor and you just go out, you ask for alms, you get your food, what you need to live, and then you can go and study. He got here and thought he was going to do that and realized, no, I actually got to make momos in a tiny little, the back of a cell phone store in Jackson Heights, where I brought Matt Baker when we did our tiny.
They were delicious.
They were delicious. And then the last thing I realized is that tiny isn't the jack of all trades. I'm like, this to me is also very what's happening today. It's like we all float along the top, and a lot of us, present company excluded, because you guys are experts, right? You're subject matter experts. But a lot of people float on the top and they don't spend a lot of time on one thing. And I found people in this book who were like nuts about one thing. A diamond district guy. I had to go to the diamond district. Find a guy who had been a gem cutter for years, trying to shave off little facets of a diamond, right? So this like whole journey, this whole book is taking me and us and all the readers through New York in a way and showing this sort of New York grit and hustle. I found a woman who only studies insects, tiny little insects, or a woman, if any of you guys nature people, bird people, there's a New York City Guide to Trees and Birds. I found a woman who wrote that book. Her name is Leslie Day. And I was like, we got to find the tiniest little plant in Central Park. So we went and found duckweed, and she taught me all about duckweed, right? But really, it's a story about this woman, Leslie, and how she fell in love with the nature of New York City and what the nature of New York City is. So that became, wow, like it's not just a cute little way in. Like this book, I really found a way to capture New York City, and every moment I kind of fell in love with every single person that I wrote about. And if I didn't fall in love with them, they didn't make it into the book, right? But I also had this tiny amount of space to try and sum up their story, and tell the story of New York City, but also tell the story of these people. And sort of the story of tiny New York, I have a Roadrunner story. Are our Roadrunners people here? Somebody asked me, like, what was the craziest thing that happened while you were reporting the book? Anybody knows this one? Also extra points. What's the tiniest distance between two subway stops? Don't say that shuttle, because you're going to be wrong.
Beverly Road and Cortelliu.
Yes! Say it!
Beverly Road and Cortelliu Road in Flatbush, Brooklyn.
Thank you. On the Q train. So I didn't even know what the Q train was. One of my friends was like, it's a weird little train. I'm like, it is a weird little train. And there's these two stops that are like 500 meters apart. And I said, all right, how am I going to tell that story? And I ended up finding that a guy who runs in the Prospect Park Track Club. And we said, all right, let's see if you can get off the Q train when it stops, go up, run to the turnstile, run to the next stop, which is 1 block away, go downstairs and see if you can get that train, get on the same train. With a Metro card. I was like, I think you should just jump the turnstile. Anyway, he didn't make it. We were like, do you think Usain Bolt could have made it? He was like, yes, probably. But he would have gotten winded, right? So people literally were like, I stayed on the train, obviously, but the runner told me later that people actually stopped and stared. And he was like, what does it take in New York City to make somebody stop and stare? That's what it is. So that was some of the craziest stuff that happened. And then I get asked the question, did you write this book for New Yorkers or did you write it for travelers? And it's called a guidebook, but I don't actually think you could use it as a guidebook because there's no map in it. I had this big discussion with my publisher. But I feel like I learned a ton of things writing this book, and so anybody who just sort of loves New York and is a New York nerd and wants to learn about the unseen, sort of unknown places that make New York, New York, it's good. And then I was talking to Matt, I was like, maybe for people who come back to New York the second time, right? Because the first time you feel like you have to check all those boxes and get your stupid Instagram thing up there with whatever it says. But maybe the second time people come back, this could be like, why don't I go out to deep Brooklyn and find the person who's making like street food from Trinidad? They're called doubles. That was like the best thing I've ever had in my life. Has anybody ever had doubles? Oh my God, they're so good. I almost cried when I was eating it. And there's somebody, again, another example of somebody who's just a master of one thing. This man and his wife are making doubles. He was so proud. He wanted to take me to the kitchen, show me how he's using fresh everything, having it shipped in. They take Trinidadian money, like, you know, and you're seeing all these different amazing subcultures of New York. I would have never seen them. So that's my spiel. That's kind of New York. Are we okay on time? Yes. Okay. If anybody wants to ask questions, I'd be happy. Also, I'm going to be selling and signing books over here. If you guys want a copy, I'll be happy to sell you one and sign it. $20. It's a bargain.
Let's see if the other microphone.
Oh. I can repeat the question. Yeah.
Who was the tiniest Yankee?
Who was the tiniest Yankee? He just got traded. I'm so mad. Ronald Torreyes. Who's my man, Ronald Torreyes? Thank you. I sound kind of like, I do know baseball, but I didn't sort of know the details. He's a utility man. You know what that is?
Yes, of course.
Of course, all right. Yeah, and his story was amazing. He's from Venezuela, and he's little. He says he's like 5'8", but I actually don't think so. I think probably whoever was his agent told him to like add an inch. And he said, they told him, you're never gonna do it, man, you're never gonna make it. You're this big, like good luck, buena suerte. And his dad was like throwing balls at him, you know, his whole life throwing balls at him, telling him that he could do it. He ended up on the New York Yankees. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen it, but the funniest thing is he would high five Judge. He would high five Judge, and he'd have to jump all the way up like this in order to hit Judge's hand. So it became this sort of like, you know, and he said to me, he was so humble, this guy, of course he was, he couldn't believe his good luck, but he was like, I'm tiny, they told me I couldn't do it, and like, here I am, you know what I mean? And I was like, and that's the sort of ethos of like people coming to New York, not having money, not speaking English, all the ways that our grandparents came here and some of our friends who just got here, right? And you just like, somehow the city, which has no room, finds a place for you. You know what I mean? You will find a place here. It's like, and living in Jackson Heights, it's like, I know the difference between Nepali, Himalayans, and Tibetans now. It's like and I know the difference between the food, and it's like they can find their own communities, and they can find people who are going to support them, and their kids are now, you know, doing well and going to Bronx Science, where I went, you know, about that. And so all these things are just like, there's no other city in the world. I don't care, London, I don't care. I'm like, there's no city like this. And it's like, you can tell I'm a New York City nerd. I love this city so much. Yeah. I'm sorry? What is that? Oh, I don't speak it, come on. I'm more of a jack of all trades, right? But I do practice Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah, how did you choose did you go think about doing historical tiny stuff? How did you choose a photographer?
I did the photography because I thought and I learned that at the Bayside Times when I was a little cub reporter. We didn't have any money, so I learned how to take pictures because when I was out reporting on the city council or whatever, you know, the school committee, I was taking my own pictures. And I thought it would help me sell the book in because they didn't have to pay for a photographer, which would have been a whole nother layer. Did you have another question besides that?
Yeah, how did you choose any historical tiny stuff?
I did, I know.
Like P.T. Barnum's
I
tiny.
didn't. I'm just like not a history buff. It was very about like today. There was some places in the book that had history, like the oldest neighborhood, that had this amazing history of being this sort of beach town from a fishing village. So in some cases I did tell history, but yeah, I think it's just not my forte. And also the New York City's tiniest library book has a fascinating history behind it. Yes?
I'm curious to know, is there a part 2 to this?
Good question. I'm thinking tiny Chicago, tiny Boston, tiny LA. I don't know if there'll be a market for this book in New York, probably. I think it could make a good TV show or a podcast. But I am thinking about other cities. So, and I think that would be, it's just, but the thing is, it's like, this is tiny of New York. Tiny in Boston, we don't like Boston, right? It's like, it's not gonna be the same.
So Kenneth?
Yeah, posthumous honor. Phil Rizzuto, late great Hall of Famer, was 5 foot 5 inches.
Thank you. Phil Rizzuto was 5'5", however, he's dead. I remember from like looking at like PC Richards, he had some commercials in the 70s. Yeah.
Money store.
Money store. That's right, money store. So no, I didn't put dead people in the book, but he was tinier than Torres, you were right.
How many locations are in the book?
There's 44, which is whose number? Thank you. And who's president? There you go. I thought those were both. We cost a lot to print books apparently, so I had 50. Obviously, 50 makes sense. We cut it down. It was so hard to let go of them, but it ended up to number 44, and I was like, that's a fortuitous number. I'll take it.
Did you have any challenges in terms of credibility, getting access to some of these places?
Good question. Did I have any problems getting access to these places? It's interesting because it's like being a reporter. The worst is always dealing with number one, a corporation, right? I wanted to do a tiny chain store, right? Because we all have these feelings about chain stores in New York. So I was like, you know what? Tiny Dunkin' Donuts. That's like the working man's coffee, right? Not Starbucks. And you know, you go, you call corporate. I think I found the smallest one. It was actually in the financial district, and they were like, yeah, well, our press person, I'll get back to you, and they never did, and they won't let you interview anybody. So like and then government, you know, dealing with the transit authority wasn't that fun. I did have to put in a special call for the NYPD because of course DCPI ignored all my queries. Why would they ever bother with this? You know, they're getting like, you know, real reporters calling them all the time. But I used to work for the police department in Philly, so I actually called in a favor. And next thing I knew, I like had a cop taking me around to all the tiny little bomb-sniffing police dogs. Yeah.
I don't know if it's in there. Are you familiar with the tiny little museum in the former elevator shaft?
I do. I tried. I'm glad you asked that. I called those guys. They didn't call me back.
Oh.
Yeah. Boo. But I did find a tiny. You know what? I'm glad because I found a tiny museum that didn't get a lot of press like those guys. Those guys got a ton of press, and they're actually an advertising company. So I'm sure they love it, but they kind of did that as a marketing strategy, which is really smart. I found these two kids who, I call them kids because they're in their 20s, and they run has anybody heard in Bed-Stuy? It's a tiny little crazy museum under the LIRR tracks in a former hair salon, and it's called Think 1994. Yes. You've heard of it?
I know.
Okay, so they started off, they're comedians, yeah, they started off doing in their own house a gallery just about the Tonya Harding, Nancy Kerrigan, because they were little kids when it happened, so for them it was like ancient history. One of them saw the Netflix thing, they became obsessed, and they ended up doing an actual gallery show about it. Now they have opened this amazing place where they just do these weird, bizarre pop culture things that are all based on how the media kind of demonizes women. So like they're just this amazing couple of friends, and yeah.
You know about the Troll Museum?
The
Troll Museum.
I do know about the Troll Museum. They're closed now, though, aren't they? Yes. Yeah.
Doing X-rated movies.
Did you ever get in trouble for anything or get in a dangerous situation doing the book?
That's a good question. No, but I'll tell this gratuitous story, which is unrelated. When I am of a certain age, right? But when I went in to interview somebody at Pumps that takes pictures, somebody asked me if I was there to do a tryout. So no, I didn't answer your question, but I got to tell you that somebody thought I could actually be a stripper, even though I'm 48,000 years old. They asked, I said no. If you have a cougar night, you know, maybe. And could I have all my clothes on? And I also can't tan. So did I get into any trouble? That's a good question. I don't think that I did.
I have a two-part question.
Go.
One is there's a guy that kind of looks like Andy Warhol that's come up twice in the pictures, and who was?
I think that must be there's a Revolutionary bookstore a bargain bookstore. I'm thinking if there's a white-haired guy. Yeah. He runs a tiny little revolutionary sort of anti-establishment bookstore, anti-capitalist, amazing bookstore in the West Village. That, by the way, used to be really big, and now he can barely afford to make a living. He's renting out all different parts of his bookstore to comic books and other things in order to survive. You know, we had a big talk about the Village and what's happening there, right? So it's like, that story actually told the story of Bob Dylan and the Village and what's happened to it by sort of price gouging realtors. You know, who, that guy was great. I think that's probably him.
No, that's
Oh,
Mark
no, that's the
Norell.
head of paleontology.
That's Mark Norell. He's
That's
the
Mark
provost
Norell.
of
He's
science.
married.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he's the head of I couldn't believe that guy met with me. That was kind of, I was like, they actually said yes to this. Yeah.
Second question,
Yeah.
I know it says in your biography, you used to work for P. Diddy.
I did used to work for P. Diddy. That's weird. Okay, that was the, is that good or bad?
Interesting.
I'll tell you, after this, everything that was tiny. I made the big mistake about 10 years ago, before we knew what reality TV was and did to people. I went on a reality show because I like adventure, which is why I like to travel, why I like Jackson Heights, why I like doing this book. And I was like, oh, that'll be fun, go on a reality show. It was called I Want to Work for Diddy. It was on VH1, and I won that shit. And I won a job working for him, which was the worst job, worst paying, worst. I got let go rather quickly because, as you can see, I'm somebody who's a little bit outspoken, which wasn't great for that job. But he's really smart and amazing, and I learned something before I got fired by him. So I did used to work for P. Diddy. I just put that in there because people think it's cool. Oh, look, that's Pumps.
Have you ever been challenged?
Challenge.
Seeing that this is not the tiniest. This is
Yes, you want to do it right now? Go. I'll take it.
I think that's my good friend Gabe up there, the cartoonist. Did you interview him?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. I found the tiniest. This was a weird one because I was like, oh, by the way, the book is in size order from the biggest thing to the smallest thing. And some of them were a little hard to measure, and one of them was I wanted to find a tiny ethnic group. So I talked to the U.S. Census and looked, and I didn't do the tiniest one, but I did a tiny one. So I found a gentleman who is Croatian. What was he? Croatian, and he's a yeah, Gabe. So he was a representative member, and I ended up telling you the story of like how he escaped communism and the Eastern Bloc and came to New York and lived a free spirit life in the Village. And so every single story sort of tells this different way of people landing in New York. So that's the tiny ethnic group. Yeah.
What's the tiniest street?
It's not in the book. You know what's hot? What is it? You know, it's Gay Street. It's in the Village. Yeah.
I believe York is right.
Oh, York. Why don't you guys should have like a wrestle match to the death? I don't know, but some of those are like, how do you tell that story through a person? It's really hard to like tell an inanimate place. So I don't know if I would have done the street anyway.
Broadway Alley is the smallest street. There's one address on it.
Thank you. Is that a question, sir? Yes. It's interesting. I was looking at this map before. I'm from the Bronx, right? There are not enough stories about in the Bronx there. Staten Island, I had to really go and dig around Staten Island, but I made sure that they were representative. I live in Queens, so I was finding all these things in Queens. It's Queens, Manhattan heavy, I would say, with a nice dash of Brooklyn, and as usual, Staten Island, the Bronx got robbed, right? That's just how it is.
So we'll do one more question, Mel.
I looked for the Bronx Zoo. I did go look for the tiniest animal, and the zoo were one of the people who blocked me. They wouldn't let me talk to somebody there because they were busy doing other things. But I thought that would have been a good story, the tiniest animal in the zoo, for sure.
Okay, then Agent.
Props to the Bronx Zoo.
No, the PhD job, that wasn't kind of the job that got fired when we had to start the club, now did it?
No. Good question, Bill. So that's it. It was so fun to talk to you guys. Thank you.